Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast, where I look to distill the best practices and best ideas of the world's most successful families and their family offices. I hope to provide thought-provoking opinions and feature amazing thought leaders to our listeners of the podcast with an eye towards the future of the family office. Today's podcast is titled Best Practices in Systems, Policy, and Procedures During COVID-19. Our special guest today is Chris Harris. He's the founder of Christian B. Harris CPA and is absolutely one of the leading authorities that I know in the family enterprise and family office community on exactly those subjects that are in our title. Systems, policy, and procedures. Now, it's going to be more focused on the family office, but a lot of this will cross over into family enterprises and businesses, investments where they may have a controlling interest, and it's important to have systems, policy, and procedures in place, and the family foundation as well. So it's more broad than just the family office, even though our conversation will be more focused on the family office. Chris has an incredibly distinguished career in the world of public and private companies, as well as well-known and iconic financial institutions and accounting firms. He's been in the industry a long, long time, and something like policy and procedures, perhaps more than anything else, this is absolutely one thing where having seen it all, yet kept abreast of the times, is incredibly important, meaning experience absolutely does matter. There are certain circumstances and certain things where it doesn't matter as much. I would agree with that. But this is something where I think it's really, really important, especially when we get to talking about internal audits. Well, after that long-winded, typical Angelo buildup, Chris, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be on your program. Thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction.
Well, it's certainly very well deserved. Why don't we get into it? And I think it's important to lay the groundwork because I think I get this question on policy and procedures or best practices in policy and procedures. Why don't we start with understanding what's the difference? What are policies and what are procedures?
Sure. Angelo, as a way of background, before we just jump right into that, I would tell you that any organization, if they want to have an effective, what we call an internal control framework, three things are required. Certainly, well-trained employees, customized processes, and yes, documented control environment. All right, so that's where our procedures come in. We need people, processes, and controls, but the key to a good control framework has to do with documenting this control environment. And the control environment consists of accounting systems and control procedures. Accounting systems and control procedures. So let's talk to that for a second. There is a difference between policies and procedures. Policies are the overall guidance. You could have a policy that says that to conduct transactions in our business, we want to use wire transfers. Okay, that's a policy. Procedures are the actual step-by-step procedures or processes that are used to affect the policy, okay? Policy lays out the guidance, procedures lay out the step-by-step processes. Now, within the processes, that's where the systems come into play, all right? Systems, very important. You have systems that talk about input. You have systems that talk about processing transactions. How do you store these transactions? What's the output, and then to how you communicate it. So again, to summarize, you've got policies, which are the overview. You have procedures, which are the step-by-step processes, and then within the process, you have the systems relative to input, output, storage, communication, and processing.
Yeah, no, that's a great description, keeping it succinct and incredibly important. So let's talk a little bit more broader, I would say falling under the auspice of policy and procedures, as well as standards, is broadly systems. Some people will call it processes to get to your outcomes. What does systems mean to you, and how important is it inside a family office?
Well, the important thing, first of all, is to identify the systems that you're going to use to affect those transactions. Okay?
Yeah.
And, when you talk about any system, again, going back to a wire transfer, it's, what system will be used to input the data? And then once we've input that data, how are we going to process that particular transaction? All right. Now, within each of these areas, input, processing, storage, output, communications, we need internal controls. And that's where the procedures come into play. A big internal control that we need, if absence of it could cause a lot of problems, is what we call access controls. So who has access controls to these systems? All right. You typically want to limit the access to these systems such that you don't have people in there finagling, or outsiders for that matter, getting into your systems. When you have people that can hack into your, quote, system, that's where you're going to have significant problems. You've heard of firewalls. Firewalls is a very good way to protect the integrity of processing those transactions. So systems, the key word there relative to systems is who has access, and how can you limit that access so that you don't have issues relative to fraud or the misappliance of that particular transaction.
Very good. So among the things that I always talk about and we've discussed are the importance of people, ideas, and machines, or AKA technology. I added a fourth, and that would be the one that we just discussed, that's systems. Really, everything in a successful family office in most enterprises is going to revolve around some combination of those four. It's hard to imagine people not being number one. The others could rotate depending on the situation and the needs of that specific family, but focusing on that, I think, is going to be really, really important. What do you do? Okay, so you want to have something like policy and procedures around wire transfers, around ACHs, and I think you have a great example that you like to give. Why don't you give that example, then I'll have some follow-up questions from that.
Sure, and getting back to your four things for success, people, machines, ideas, and systems, without any question, what it really boils down to is people be able to make best decisions. And that comes from, things like, machine intelligence. So, machine intelligence is right up there today without any question. But the systems are important. But even with machine intelligence and with ideas and system, again, it boils back to having the right people in the right spots. But let's pick up again on wire transfers, okay? So the policy is that periodically, when it's more expedient to transfer funds from one bank to another, or from one bank to a vendor, or from one bank to another institution, and a wire is the way to go, then that's clearly an issue that you want to make sure that you got, or an area that you want to make sure that you have the appropriate procedures. Now, the procedures are basically four things. Okay, if I were to be developing wire transfer procedures, I'd look to have four things. Number one, I would establish what we call a wire service agreement with the banks to describe the nature of the incoming and outgoing wire transfers, such that alerts could arise when a wire does not meet that profile. That's the first thing you do. That's the first procedure that you want to have. The second procedure, there's going to be four, but the second one says to establish what we call access controls, procedures requiring such things as dual-factor authentication, as well as callbacks to verify the identity of the beneficiary of the wire and the payment instructions. All right? The third procedure that you're going to have is to establish key documentation regarding the originating person, the beneficiary bank, or the country designation. All right? The fourth thing that you want to have, the fourth procedure, has to do with just a simple wire transfer request form. That's for processing outgoing and incoming wires, requiring that the approval by the owners and or the designated person that's sending it. So wires are a good example. They clearly, think about someone, who's got to affect these transactions, and they don't have these procedures laid out in front of them. I mean, it's virtually impossible, because if you don't have these things, and it allows people to come in potentially. You know, you could have the wire sent to the wrong place. You could have the wire sent for the wrong amount. So wires are a good example in terms of the importance of having systems in place to affect the procedures that follow up on the particular policy.
Yeah, that is really, really well said. During normal times, this is incredibly important. During the times we're going through now, it's mid-June during the COVID-19 in the greater New York City area. We're working remote. We don't have that kind of the power and the eyes and ears on walking the halls. So that's been pulled from us. And again, I think there's some advantages relative to remote, which we went over in other podcasts that I won't bore people on. But it does stress, and every family office should be doing a what-if scenario and stress test that's known as a tabletop exercise. You should have heard one of our other podcasts we did a couple of weeks back on that. So hopefully you understand the importance of that. But everything that we just discussed, the importance of systems, of policy and procedures, it seems like they get amplified during a time like this when we're separated and pulled apart. I mean, I guess that's a pretty obvious yes, of course, but what else could you add to that in terms of how we could still be more in harmony when we're working remotely on policy and procedures and broadly systems?
Sure. You know, the key to any successful business is certainly communication, without any question, okay? I mean, you can have, again, getting back to machines and ideas and systems and even people, but, you know, communication is such a key. And, you know, how to affect communication, particularly in these particular times when it's maybe some people don't have the technology. Some people, you have to go out and set up the offices. It's, you know, the systems become more important relative to ongoing communication, which is absolutely essential for people making, again, it all comes back to making the best decisions. I mean, every day, all of us, you, me, we're faced with a lot of alternatives relative to making a good decision relative to a business opportunity. And the best thing you can do is to gather information. And how do you do that? You know, you have to make sure that you've got procedures set up. And remotely, it's difficult. You know, it's very, very difficult. You know, again, you mentioned the expression walk the hall. It's a very expression of mine, you know, and in my years of public accounting, you know, we always stress that, you know, walk the halls, get to know those people, you know, see what they're thinking, you know, get their input. But again, absence of all that, it falls back on systems. And systems, what we talked about before, you know, how do we input? How do we process? How do we store? What's the output? What are the communications? So systems become even more critical when people are working remotely and there's not that direct oversight. There's not that, you know, back and forth dialogue. You know, sometimes decisions require dialogue, you know, and then, you know, absence communication, you know, I think, which is the key here to affecting what's going on in this particular environment is huge. And again, it comes back to people, making sure you have people that can just articulate, you know, that's my thoughts on that.
I mean, then that does bring me to the point. Yeah, it's great to have written. And when I say written, in today's world, especially now during COVID and what we're learning and playing out disaster scenarios, that it be something in the cloud or in Google where it could be shared with a team or a group. So, okay, something like that touches the money, cash management, wire transfers, even potentially aggregating and reporting on assets, because it's important to know the value of what you own, the breakdown, the tax lot account, et cetera.
Absolutely.
But I mean, I suppose you can't have everything that has a specific policy and procedure. And if it's too rigid, sometimes you do need to think out of the box. You need to be creative in the moment. You need to do something without per se asking for approval. I'm only slightly chuckling because that may need a policy and procedure allowing that person to be able to make a decision without quote unquote a layer of approval. But Are you a fan? This would probably mean a manual that's like 500 pages, but in theory, should you policy and procedure everything?
Yeah, that's a great question. And and honestly, with the different family-owned organizations that I've worked with over the years, I get the same question. They say, "Gosh, Chris, we'd like to have all these procedures, which people know about, but we know that they should be documented. Where do we start?"
Yeah.
I mean, where do we start? And where we start, it's a simple answer. It's all risk-based. In other words, when I sit down with an owner, to talk about his business, to put together an audit plan, or just to hear what his strategy is, you have to say, okay, owner, what keeps you up at night? What do you worry about? Is it liquidity? Is it asset allocation? Is it service agreement fees? Is it partner distributions? I mean, what is it that you're worried about? And once you get an idea of those half a dozen or dozen different areas that concern this owner, okay, then you sit down and you sort of risk rate those. You say, okay, are you more concerned about service agreement fees, or are you more concerned about partnership distributions? Or are you more concerned about asset allocation, or are you more concerned about liquidity? Or are you more concerned about the validity of your accounting records? Okay, so we'll sit down and we'll risk rate those. And let's just say we come up with a dozen and we risk rate them from high to moderate to low. And at that point, that's the trail, if you would, in terms of where you would expect to see policies. For instance, if I go in and audit an area, if I'm asked to go in periodically and look at the accuracy of the service agreement fees that partnerships are supposed to get, the first thing I'm going to ask for at the client or at the family business is, may I see your policy? May I see your procedure? I mean, I'm going to audit to your procedure. I'm not going to audit to what I think is the best practice. Let's hope that it is the best practice. But if it isn't, let me see your procedure relative to how you ensure that you're getting service agreement fees from participating partnerships. Once I get the policy and then read the procedure, then I put together the plan. So to answer your question, it's very difficult, particularly with a business that has limited resources. I mean, so you gain an understanding. The owner sits down and says, okay, these are the dozen things that keep me up at night. So that's where we want to make sure that we have our policies, without any question.
Yes, it's identifying what's important to the owner, perhaps the head of the family office, and really identifying those things first. That probably also should be looked at perhaps once a quarter, perhaps even arguably more frequently if they're that critical and important.
Right.
As well as potentially adding and building on that once you get the framework of the most important areas down. And really, again, I use the word touching the money. Anything that touches the money that someone could have access and resources, wires, ACHs, etc. I mean, that really does need, quote unquote, a set of rigorous policy and procedures. An example that we sometimes give is during COVID-19, where we're remote, what happens if that, quote unquote, that CFO goes down? And that was the only person that knew how to do so many different things. So how do you cross-train, preferably polymath skills inside the family office? But it makes it easier if there's a little bit of a framework for this is a blueprint for how we do it. We're breaking it down. Now, something like a wire or ACH should be applicable for the next person stepping up and doing it. But there are certain things that are more art than science that, yeah, the person temporarily in their shoes may not be as good. But, these are the challenges of, again, diversity and cross-training, having a outsourced partner that could step in, an auditing or accounting firm, someone like yourself. So, these are all the things that you see in the real world.
Right. And in fact, I can tell you there's a small business over that I worked with over in New Jersey for a number of years, and the controller, became ill. And who did they come to? They said, Chris, you know our business better than anybody. You're a CPA. You used to do the audit here. Can you step in for a couple of months? So we did it. So it gets back to connections. It gets back to working with people that are well trained. It gets back to people that know the business. But, and it's difficult for family-owned businesses because a lot of people first of all, they don't have there's not a lot of resources. You may just have a controller, you may just have maybe a bookkeeper, you probably have an investment advisor, perhaps you even have a tax person, okay, and perhaps even have a legal person. So the concept of cross-training, like you just mentioned, is very, very critical. But you can't cross-train unless there's something written down relative to what they're supposed to do. Okay, so can you imagine a controller trying to sit down with 5 different people and say, okay, I want you to work on bank reconciliations. I want you to handle general ledger maintenance. You can work about access controls, and don't forget the real estate partnership distributions or the service agreement fees. So all the more importance to having written procedures so that people can learn, and if they have to fill someone else's shoes, at least they have the playbook. They've got the menu. They've got the recipe. Absence all that, boy, you're swimming upstream.
And I've been pounding in the work that I do with families for many years and my level of consulting. At the end of the day, this is going to be a little rough. Let's see if you agree, Chris. At the end of the day, the buck stops with the family. It stops with the principal. If you have a bad family office, that's on you. You need to spend the money, the time, and put in the effort and hire the right people. That's a talent, and that's on you. It's also on you to make sure if something goes wrong and the family office is whatever, no longer there, someone dies that's important, could you, as the person who is the money, the family office, do you rely on everything to be done by the family office, or do you have a framework of understanding investments, taxes, wealth transfer, where you could at least understand it and step in? And again, this goes to policy and procedures and select outsource partners that could help as well. And I know that sounds a little rough, but it's true. You have to realize if things really go to hell in a handbasket, people are going to care about themselves. And that applies to most SFO executives, and you kind of have to understand that. So I'm always a little concerned with the family that gets too removed from their money and from effectively the whole process of being a successful family. And they look to just have more and more people to do more and more things for them. And then something goes wrong, or they wonder why the generations don't transfer over with wealth and success and legacy in the family. I went off on a tangent there, Chris, but how do you feel about that?
No, I think you're preaching to the choir. I think it's without any question. It gets back to planning. It gets back to understanding, roles, responsibilities, and so I've a number of the family businesses that I've worked with. I'm working now with the second generation. I knew the father real well, for many years, and now he's turning it over to the son. Sometimes your outside folks like myself, people like yourself can be very good. We're outsiders. We're sort of independent. And sometimes we can help guide through, that second generation because, they didn't work as hard as the father or the mother to build that business. And, sometimes, the absence guidance, it gets very difficult. So, no, I think you're absolutely spot on.
And I know the topics that we're talking about. Listen, if you're listening to this as an entrepreneur, as a wealth principal, even as a family member, yeah, it's exciting to talk about direct investing in startups and, being Machiavellian and conquering the world. And those are great. We love those subjects as well. But what helps to determine greatly going from good to great and great to exceptional is, using football terms, the blocking and tackling. It's a little bit more dry. It's a little bit more mundane than the flashy running back, quarterback, or receiver. And again, my international audience is not going to have any idea what I'm talking about using American football as the example of my analogy. But you need to develop the nuts and bolts of best practices, of systems and policy and procedures if you're going to withstand a shock and a challenge, and if you're going to excel and put your family office in an opportunity to be excellent, you need to hold them to a certain standard. And there needs to be policy and procedures in place. I'm emphasizing this with a little bit of extra oomph in my voice because I've been doing this for so long. These are the things that I see. I could give all of you my secrets to what makes a highly successful SFO. I've shared some of that in my books, in my podcast, in my writing. It's not the raw knowledge of what to do. I could provide a blueprint for that. It really is going to be your ability to personally execute upon that, which is where so many unfortunately fall short. And you see so much, Chris. I mean, this must be, again, it's probably music to your ears, but the importance of what we're talking about today and having a framework to pass on to what makes a family office excellent and really what relates to the best of the best and best practices.
Yeah, let me just comment on that because you touched upon some good thoughts there. Again, when you talk about tabletop scenarios, a very appropriate topic for right now. What you're really talking about is risk. Okay, the successful businesses, organizations, families, whatever, how they manage risk, whatever the risk is. Again, whether it's partnership, service fees, investment income, how they manage risk will determine their success. When I sit down with an owner and I'm spending the afternoon or whatever it is and we're going over things, I try to get a sense from him as to what the business plan is. It's like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Okay. All right. Well, so they lay out the plan. All right. But then I take it another step farther. We take it another step forward. I don't like that word I. We look at the strategy to implement the plan. Okay. And then what we do again is we look at the risks within the strategy. Okay. So you have an overall business plan, and sometimes people get confused. I'll ask an owner for his strategic plan, and then he'll hand me the business policy, or he'll hand me the business plan, and I'll say, well, owner, that just tells me where you want to be. That's important, but as an outside professional, if you really want me to help you manage risk, I have to understand what your strategy is to achieve those goals. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about the risks within that strategy. And oh, by the way, once we've touched upon the risks, okay, then we'll ensure that we've got policies around those particular risks. Now, the risk could be in transaction risk. It could be operational risk. It could be fraud risk. It could be income tax compliance risk. So share with me the risks within the strategy to achieve the goal, and we'll take it 2 steps farther. We'll make sure that your people know those risks. Okay, again, it gets to communication, and maybe your son should get to know that. Maybe he should understand what the risks are in the strategy to achieve the goals. And let's make sure that once he understands that, or she understands that, by the way, maybe that's an area where we ought to have a written policy or a written procedure. So I think, again, you're spot on. I think, I sort of look at policies and procedures as the same way. To me, a policy is like a business plan. Okay, a procedure is like the strategic plan. Okay, the procedure lays out the strategy to achieve the goals within the business plan. Okay, and it gets back to, what are the risks within the strategic plan, and then it gets back to systems. It always comes back to systems. What are the controls around input, processing, storage, outputting, and communication? Long-winded answer. I'm sorry, but you're hitting a real nerve here with me.
Yeah, and apparently I'm rubbing off on you, but that's a good thing. I mean, I want to have hear your passion and your in-depth thoughts that are more than just sound bites. Safe to say, I completely concur. I'll pounce upon that a little bit. Okay, here's your destination that you want to get to, but how are you going to get there? And like you said, it could be I'm concerned about the markets tanking, or I have illiquid positions that are going to be hard and not logical for me to exit. What happens if they take a 30 or 40% hit? How could I hedge that? Well, yeah, there are ways you could hedge illiquid private equity and real estate positions. We've actually covered that before. I'm not going to waste time. That's a comprehensive dialogue to talk in something like this. But how about operational risk? How about banking failure? And more so in other countries, but government confiscation, which happens here. It happens through all our forms of taxation and to some degree through regulation, but it happens also more by force, per se, in other countries. So if the family's already rich, they're already rich. They want to remain that way so they can have choices moving forward. So mitigating risk and hedging against quote unquote black swan, and for sure, best practices, systems, policy, and procedures. You may only need to use it on rare occasion, but when you need it, you really need it to be there. And that does help to define the difference along with leadership and culture and systems in terms of, again, going from good to great. Let's
excellent point. Excellent point.
Well, thank you. Let's dive a little bit more into something specific relative to should family offices utilize an internal auditor?
Well, of course, it's somewhat biased, as you can suspect, but I think, the question is, why should owners utilize internal audit? And I can think of four things that would certainly satisfy any owner if I could get to the right audience. Number one, the internal auditor can provide a key ingredient into a solid internal control framework. As we spoke about a control framework, it has to do with people, processes, and controls. And within the controls, you have accounting systems and control procedures. So that if you wanted to have a professional and independent, auditor come in, he or she can be a key ingredient for a solid internal control framework. The second thing that an owner can utilize internal audit for is they can provide the owners with independent thinking, testing, and evaluation of key processes. Okay, let me say that again. They can provide the owners with independent thinking, testing, and evaluation of key controls, the second point. The third thing, and why I think owners should consider utilizing internal audit, is that the internal auditor, can give the owner, quite frankly, peace of mind that their accounting records are accurate and complete. I must tell you, when I meet with owners, pretty high up on the flip chart is, Chris, how can I assure that the records are accurate? I've got to make tough decisions every day. And if they're not posting daily, if we're not getting in the correct service agreement fees, if the partnership distributions are not coming in, so if anything, we can give them what I would call peace of mind. The fourth thing, and I think it's a very important one that auditors can do, is to be a resource to owners. Special projects where internal staff is limited or they have no knowledge, okay? Second, guidance on tabletop scenarios that could affect the small businesses. How about best practices for the development of policies and procedures? And lastly, let's not overlook this one, guidance to prevent fraud. Okay, so why should owners utilize internal audit? We can be a key ingredient from the internal control framework. We can provide them independent thinking. We can give them peace of mind. And oh, by the way, when needed, we can be a significant resource to that owner for matters of importance to him or her.
And so, and you mentioned it, but I guess another important role is the internal auditor to help train the staff on internal control, a framework and components that make it up, just so they understand that there's a certain rigor and an institutional approach in terms of how we do things here.
Yeah. I think that, to achieve, a good framework, it gets back to education. It gets back to training. I mean, it's time and time again, it's when you go into an organization, it's so easy to criticize, the staff. But if they haven't been trained, then that's not a fair evaluation. So training is huge. I mean, you clearly want your people to be well trained. You want them to be able to think out of the box. And oh, by the way, integrity, attitude, attention to detail, being responsible, proactive, professional. All those are particular topics that, that I spend time with the different organizations that I work with. It sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but let me tell you something. If people buy into it, if they understand that roles and responsibilities should be defined, that people should be taking ownership for what is expected of them to get done. And oh, by the way, think out of the box if something doesn't look right. And don't forget, how about asking a question, if something just doesn't look right. So training to office staff, I do it. I can't tell you how many frequent times I do it, and at all levels. It doesn't have to be the bookkeepers. I mean, it can be the controllers. It can be people that work in investments. It can be the people that are working in the banking side of things. I mean, it's, clearly you have to have the right trainer, but, you clearly have access to all of that with your network of people. But training is, it's so critical because things are changing. Things change every day. How we transact business, how we transact, what we do. It's training is key without any question. It certainly helps for making better decisions, and that's what you want. You want your staff to be able to make the best decisions possible, and that'll comes from training.
Which really relates to at the heart of what governance is in terms of also how we make decisions. So the things that we spoke about today, and kind of in concluding, it's more complicated in an existing enterprise or family office because you, to some degree, it's a little siloed. We have a way of doing things. It gets a little insular. I always talk about the value, and this takes a leader of the family office to actually be really big, is to understand we could get siloed, that we could all use a second set of eyes, that we have blind spots, that we all fall a trap to anchoring and group thinking, and the opportunity to have someone that we could bounce ideas off of and share best practices is really, really, really important. So part of the challenge in an existing family office is there's a legacy that to some degree on the family and leadership and SFO side that you kind of have to navigate, and sometimes very carefully. But if you're setting up a new family office, and that's again, among the most common inquiries that we get, you actually, especially now in today's world, what's happening with working remotely with technology, I'm not going to quite use the words you have a chance to do it right, but you have a chance to really develop something that could be special and would be easier to adapt moving forward than really having to turn the boat completely around. What are some of the things that you would maybe recommend to a newer family office in terms of establishing some level of institutional best practices, policy, and procedures, and getting everyone on board from the get-go, which you potentially have that ability if you're consulting and creating a new family office?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's interesting. Way back in the mid-90s, four of us, we were all partners in Big 8 firms, different firms, and we conceived of a product that it was way ahead of its time, but it was a product that was desperately needed by financial institutions. And the four of us got together, I can remember, down at a restaurant down in Philadelphia, and we talked about it. And it's like the idea section, that you had of the four things. And one of the things that we thought would be best is if we put together an advisory board. Okay, I mean, we were all, professional people. We'd spent our whole careers in public, mostly working with financial institutions. But, we wanted the gray hairs. We wanted some people that could guide us through making the tough decisions. We wanted someone that was going to challenge our business plans and challenge our strategic plans. So we formed an advisory group. There were only like four people that were on our advisors. And, we met every month with these men. Okay. Every month we put together business plans. I would tell you, if I was starting out a business today, and boy, I can remember back when we started ours, the first thing we did was to put together that business plan. We wanted to make sure, and we wanted to make sure that first of all we had a product that was going to be out there. Now I'm not going to get into what the product was, but we were so far ahead of ourselves. It was terrific for us. But so to answer your question a little more concisely, put together a business plan. I would suggest that you get an advisory group. Doesn't have to be a big group. Preferably men that you know, and maybe men or women that maybe you don't know. There's a lot of people, organizations that are willing to step in and work as an advisory group to young entrepreneurs that are coming out. So the third thing I would do is to make sure that you're very, very selective in terms of the people that you bring on. Okay, so it's people, processes, and controls. If you've got the right people, if you've got the right business plan, and you have the right control environment relative to accounting advisors, the world's your oyster. I mean, you'll do well. So that's my recommendation.
I think that's a very, very good one. And we have a significant masterclass series for my members, and we may make it available for subscription to non-members on, it's the most comprehensive on creating a resilient, anti-fragile family office. We're going to be rolling that out this summer. I spent months and months on it. It's miles ahead of my book and other things that I've done, and I'm really, really excited about it. So again, this really gets to the heart of who we are and what I'm obsessive about, and someone has to be. So why not me on single family offices? And the time of COVID has really sparked a tremendous level of creativity and adaptability in me and what I'm doing in my organization. And again, in some ways, I do miss physical events and getting face-to-face with people. But in some ways, this has been a tremendous long-term benefit to me as we've adapted so much of what we do, and much of it, and I mean much of it, for the better. So it's really been a very, very exciting time. Chris, for those that would like to learn more about your work in best practices, systems, policy, and procedures as an internal auditor, and again, I think you're one of the best in the world, so happy to—
You're very kind, thank you.
To give you the thumbs up. How could they learn more about your business?
Let them contact you.
Oh, no, I may get too many inquiries. We don't want that to happen.
No, let them contact you.
I have to work too hard.
I'm fine with that. No, I mean, I've got an email. I'm in LinkedIn. If you want to try that route, that's fine. But
Yeah, I mean, Chris is in a very good position, everyone. He's had a highly successful career, and people find him even when he's kind of quasi a little bit off the grid in the radar, because he's just so well known and so regarded in our community, and such a wonderful person of character and the quality of his work. And absolutely someone that I would use inside of broadly the quarterbacking, the consultative process that we do as well inside Family Office Association. Actually, and I kind of have rolled that out in other podcasts. So Chris, we call that effectively, it's Angelo's Family Office Association Dream Team.
I love that.
And, it's a global Rolodex of hundreds or thousands, but really I narrowed it down to hundreds of unique relationships across all fields, including those that would be a little bit out of the box for the family office work. Architecture, creativity, the arts, but thinking about things from a right brain perspective. Sometimes you're better off not being the expert. You're better off coming in with a totally blank slate and matching that up with where it's important to have, again, experiences and a specific skill set. So to me, that's a lot of fun. I find it exciting, and I think you're great. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast and founder and CEO of Family Office Association. We're a global membership organization dedicated to families of great success and their family offices, providing a significant amount of proprietary content, perhaps more than anyone else in the world, hosting global events on hold due to COVID-19, but Monday through Friday for our members, hosting online video meetings. We've had amazing guests like Chris and many others. Just this week, we have just so many rock star guests. I'm really, really excited. And all that we're doing, like I noted, from a creativity perspective and consultative perspective, like the Dream Team initiative that I noted, it's been an intriguing time. You may want to learn more. FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. My email is angelo@FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. And I'm very active on social media, including LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. My channel there is Family Office. I registered that a long time ago, so got a good name on YouTube. Whew, that was a lot. Everyone,
that was a lot.
I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Chris, it was amazing to have you as a guest. Everyone, again, that's Chris Harris. He's the best. Pleasure was all mine. Look forward to the next time.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.